Hello and welcome. I'm Miguel Albero, the Cultural Council of Spain in Washington, D.C. I'm very happy to be here with you for this event, the PALABRA Archive, Eduardo Lago. This conversation is part of a series organized with the IberoAmerican Cultural Attaches Association and the Hispanic Division of the Library of Congress. La Palabra Archive is a collection of original audio recordings of 20th and 21st century Luso-Hispanic poets and writers reading from their works. It has a really impressive collection so far of more than 800 recordings, with names such as Borges, Cortázar, Gabriel García Márquez, Gabriela Mistral, you name it. And also our Juan Ramón Jiménez, who was a teacher, by the way, here in DC. And we're very proud that part of this collection is one of our most talented Spanish writers, Eduardo Lago. And we're having the conversation today with him. Eduardo recorded his an interview during the celebration of the Iberian Suite on March 14, 2015, at the John Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. And he's having this conversation today with David Hollander. Eduardo, as I said, is one of our most talented writers. He's also, and I guess, the one that has more helped to introduce American literature in Spain. He won the Nadal Prize in Spain for his first novel, Llámame Brooklyn, Call Me Brooklyn, in 2013. And he has also been director of the Cervantes Institute in New York. He's lived in New York since 1987. And he's done a lot of interviews of the most important American writers, most of them in El País. To say just a few names: Norman Mailer, John Barth, Toni Morrison, Philip Roth, Don DeLino, again, you name it, David Foster Wallace. And as I said before, he was also a director of the Cervantes Institute of New York, and he teaches at the Sarah Lawrence College. He's been translated into English. His last segment of his last novel, Siempre supe que te volvería a ver, Aurali, into English. And I'm going to give the floor now to David Hollander, who's also a writer. He's a colleague of Eduardo, not only because he also teaches at the same college, but also because he's a writer, finalist of the NYPL Young Lions Award. He has a recent novel. Eduardo is going to talk a little bit about it. And he's written short fiction and non-fiction also that has appeared in different forums. So David, you have the floor. Very happy to have you here today.
Well, thank you so much, Miguel. It's definitely an honor, to be asked to do this with Eduardo. And so, thank you to everyone involved in organizing the event. And of course to Eduardo, my old and very dear friend. And I thought we could start this conversation by playing a short audio clip of Eduardo speaking in Spanish with English subtitles that will touch on the origins and the structure of Eduardo's first novel, which you just mentioned, Miguel, Call Me Brooklyn, winner of the Nadal Prize. So Ander, if you're out there and you could play the first clip for us, and then Eduardo will use that for a leaping off point for our conversation.
La novela fue gestándose de manera bastante autónoma, es decir, casi con independencia de lo que yo quería hacer. Había un mundo narrativo dentro de mí y fue dándose a sí mismo forma, pero esencialmente consiste en la historia de un hombre que vive en Brooklyn y que tiene 50 y algunos años y que toda su vida se dedica a escribir un libro que no consigue terminar, y además él sabe perfectamente que no lo va a poder terminar nunca. Hay un lugar en Brooklyn Heights, es un bar de unos españoles, de un bar real que llevaban unos señores que ya han fallecido todos, pero es un bar muy conocido en Nueva York, que se llama El Montero. En este lugar nos reuníamos un grupo de artistas españoles, pintores, cineastas, músicos, bailarines, mucha gente, escritores, y todas las noches, como si estuviéramos en España hablando, ¿no? Lo hacíamos en nuestro lugar. El dueño del bar era un hombre muy interesante, había acogido a mucha gente, se reunían allí marineros, sobre todo daneses y también españoles, pero también norteamericanos. Era un punto de encuentro muy interesante de muchísima gente. Este bar había tenido una primera localización en los muelles de Brooklyn, luego cuando eso se convirtió en un terreno que no podían utilizar, subió hacia Hicks, al lado de Atlantic Avenue, la calle Hicks. Y allí fue donde fueron surgiendo todas las historias que yo iba a contar a los marineros y a los que estaban en el bar. Y me tuve que crear dos personajes ficcionales para que ellos fueran los vehículos a través de los cuales se canalizara la historia. Finalmente, junto al hombre de unos 55 años hay un hombre joven que es un periodista que tiene unos 30, que se está separando de su mujer, entonces por las noches no sabe qué hacer y acaba en ese bar por casualidad y empieza a haber conversaciones entre el hombre mayor y el hombre joven en el que empieza un proceso de transmisión de todo el texto que va a ser después la novela. Entonces esto es un recurso que después los críticos me dijeron que era muy propio de Cervantes, tener dos narradores y que la historia no pertenecía a nadie, etcétera. Y ahí empezó una historia muy compleja que se desarrolla en varios niveles.
Thank you. So, Eduardo, I know that when I first met you, probably back in 2000, 2001, this was a book you were working on, Call Me Brooklyn, and you were living in New York at that time. I'm wondering if you could, was the entirety of this book written while you were living in New York? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit maybe about the role living in New York played in the construction of this your first novel.
Well, first I would like to thank you all who made this possible. And I feel very comfortable because I'm surrounded by very good friends, not just friends. Miguel is a very good friend. He's also a very talented writer with a very fine sense of humor. And David is also a good friend and a colleague at the college where we teach, Sarah Lawrence. And we had many conversations, also with my translator into Call Me Brooklyn into English. And one of the few people who actually have read the novel, because although I have several books, quite a few, only one has been translated into English so far. So there's like a secret story before this. And the secret story is that although I have written since I was 8 years old, I have always been very reluctant to publish. And that is exactly where I am right about this at the very end. So for some reasons, I was always attracted to New York. And in 1987, I came with the idea of staying for a year. And now this is the 33rd year I'm still here, okay, and teaching at this place, which changed my life to have that position, I must say. So the book is a reaction to my arrival in New York. I have hundreds of notebooks, hundreds, maybe 600, 700, I don't know, where I have always been writing notes, stories, scripts, all kinds of things without any kind of order, just wrote when I arrived in New York City. So I had this reaction to the fact that I was in New York. My first job was in a high school, in a vocational and technical high school. Weapons around me, drugs, attacks, a very interesting introduction to New York City in Brooklyn. And I began to give the notebooks a single name, although there were many. It was called El Cuaderno de Brooklyn, Brooklyn Notebook. So I never wanted to publish anything, but in 2000, I betrayed myself and published 2 books. One of them was called Scattered Tales, Cuentos Dispersos, which was with the owner of Turner, Manuel Arroyo, who gave me this edition. I mean, he just took care of the finances and produced 200 copies. But that was my first betrayal to myself as a writer. I published. The second betrayal was that they called me from a small publisher in the city of Zaragoza in Spain, and they told me that they would like to publish something by me. And again, I betrayed myself, and I gave them something called El Cuaderno de México, which had to do with a trip I did to Mexico with my wife, Georgina, and all the notes that I put together there. So those 2 books came out in 2000. But having titled one of the books, El Cuaderno de Brooklyn, my novel had to change the title. It could not be El Cuaderno de Brooklyn because of El Cuaderno de México. So after many names and many years, it came up being Call Me Brooklyn, which is an homage to two great novels. Obviously, Call Me Ismail, Moby Dick, very obviously, and also Call It a Dream, okay, by Henry Roth, which are just two references, two hidden or not so hidden references. Actually, to make a very long story short, I began to organize my notebooks into something that could be a novel. In 1988, a year after my arrival, I began to go to Montero Bar, which still exists, is there, right? And I sometimes go there. Nobody knows who I am, thank God. So in my visits to that place, very early, I found many years later, after the publication in the Nadal Award Prize, I found a manuscript 3 or 4 pages long, which is what was happening at a night in Montero. And what happened at Montero in a night could be 1,000 novels, because there were prostitutes, dancers, drug dealers, maneuvers outside in the dark. And there are many crazy stories around that place. And there was a place upstairs with rooms, I don't know, crazy things. So what happened is that I became friends with the owner of the bar, whose name was Jose Otero, and he liked me, and he began to tell me stories. So he told me all kinds of stories. Then I became friends with the sailors there, and they told me all kinds of crazy stories as well, wonderful stories. And there were Spaniards, there were Cubans, there were Latin Americans, there were Danish sailors, and I just put all the stories in notebooks, as always, right? Now, I could not begin to write my novel because I was not ready for that. What do I mean? Is that when I began my novel, I was in my mid-30s, and when I finished it, I was in my mid-50s, which means that I had to wait all that time to have the two perspectives. The story of Brooklyn, in my words, begins with someone who is in his 30s and ends with someone who is in his 50s. So this man who is drinking himself to death, Gal Ackerman, meets the journalist from the New York Post, who finds him there by chance, and they begin to have these conversations. For many years, maybe 10 years, I had a huge problem, which was that I had no idea of who the young man was. And I could not even give him a nationality. For a while, he was Belgian. Why? I have no idea. Probably because I didn't know what origin to ascribe to him. And finally, when I had a deep enough relationship with the city of New York, could I realize that he could be Spanish? And then I found the link in a very important moment, which has to do with the story of the two countries, which is the Spanish Civil War, when the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, among other forces, went there to fight fascism and fight for freedom. And that was the connection. And that's why I made my character, the old man, an orphan of the Spanish Civil War, adopted by Americans. This is a way of saying that this novel needed 15 years to be born in many ways because of the reasons that I said. And I was working unconsciously. And also I had the problem of my reluctance to publish, which was overcome thanks to the fact that I met an American agent in Barcelona, Antonia Kerrigan, who read half of my novel, and she wrote back to me and she said, I don't know if you're aware of what you have here, but I think this is an important book. So please work on it. You have me at your disposal. This meant 6 more years, totaling, as I say, 15. So when I finished that, then Antonia Kerrigan began to move the book around, and all publishers were interested in Spain. When she came up with the plan, said, I think that if we present this to the Nadal Prize, it may win, because I heard that very often they don't have very good originals. So this is what happened, and that is what changed my life. I have an anecdote with a very dear friend of mine, Jesus, who is living in Navarra now, and I call him very shyly because he's totally against publishing. He just despises all that, marketing, etc. So I called him somewhat in fear because he's 7 years my elder. I said, Eduardo, I just won the, I mean, Jesus, I just won the Nadal Prize. He was very serious. He said, that's what happens. That's the risk one runs if one publishes. He said, regretting the fact, the origin of the novel, in a nutshell.
Well, but I wonder, this idea of a reluctance to publish, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. If you're not writing, if you're not producing these works, which clearly you are like deeply immersed in these books as you're writing them, this is a book that took 15 years. If you weren't writing it to publish it, why are you writing? Like, what is your, what brings you to the page every day? And also, how have you overcome that reluctance to publishing, and why?
There is, I mean, my novel is full of secrets that critics will never figure out. One of the secrets is that I had my uncle Antonio Lago, who lived all his life in Paris because he was escaping Franco's Spain. I mean, he could not take the atmosphere in Spain. He was not persecuted or anything. He lives in Paris. So there's an episode at the beginning of Call Me Brooklyn when they go to see a painter who lives there. The name is Antonio Ramos. And my uncle was very frail and very constitutionally, and he was a painter, and he had a house in Altea on the Mediterranean. And he liked to smoke downhill cigarettes, which are very strong, and he had very bad lungs, and in the war he lost the lung, so he had only one functional lung. And his doctor said to him, Antonio, if you keep on painting the way you're doing it now, you are going to die. And my uncle said, you're wrong, doctor. If I stop painting, I will die. So that's what I apply to myself in terms of my writing. If I didn't write, I would die. But I don't need the market. I don't need the audience. I don't need anyone else. This is something that I have always doing, and it's buried in there's a lot of me in Gal. So now there's some silly component in this attitude. It's a little bit childish. I am aware of that. And then things changed with Call Me Brooklyn because it became a very well-known novel. It sold many copies, I think, and I became more or less a more public figure, although I continued with my journalism, which is my way of communicating with the world. So after that, I have published some books, very few, I must say. And now I'm going back to that sentiment I had for so many years, because I just I just finished the book and I don't want to publish it. But I don't know how to go about that, because at the same time, I am with one of the most powerful agencies in the world, which is the Wiley Agency. And they are very helpful and very diligent and very active. So I think that there's a contradiction that is not completely resolved there. And it's a little bit silly because it has to do with my rejection of certain things, of certain types of literature. And as I grow old, and now I'm in my mid-60s, I realize that there's room for all kinds of literature, including the literature that I'm not interested in, like, I don't know, bestsellers and things like that. So
Yes.
Enough of that. I mean, there's room for everybody. So this means that I should publish, perhaps.
Well, maybe it's also strikes me as, given how well received your books that have been published have been, there's something generous also about publishing, because I think there are people who really need your books, to put it bluntly. So it's also, I think there's something generous about somebody in your position publishing their books. It's giving a part of yourself to others.
I am very isolated in New York. My best friends cannot read my work like you. So that adds a layer of solitude to my work. And one of the best friends that I have and who communicates with me secretly is the great writer Enrique Villamatas. who is very important. Yesterday I was reading what he says about my book. It's more complicated than that. The next novel after Brooklyn proper is I Always Knew I Would See You Again, Aurora Lee, of which we will talk later, right?
Yes.
So besides the blurb that Enrique wrote for me, he read the novel before. Here in his newest book, which is a book of conversations, he is very generous with me himself because we talk all the time. We talk all the time. And I think that I influenced his life as well, secretly, like when I founded the Order of Finnegans and we used to go to Dublin, a series of crazy writers who pretended to be in love with James Joyce Ulysses, things like that. Very interesting episode. So what he says is more accurate. I have some readers who write to me. I have people who said, when is your next book coming out? But the most adequate thing is what Enrique says. Aurora Lee, for short, is the first title of a collection that had an infamous trajectory in Spain, which is Malpaso, that began publishing incredible books, and then there were dark maneuvers there again, strange things going on. The editors had to resign. But it was the first author of Malpaso, which I hold as an honor myself. And they put a lot of energy into my book, and they invested in it. But readers just didn't get it. They didn't get it, which is what Vilamata says. Maybe I'm writing for the future, I don't know. So what happens is that what Vilamata says in that page that I read to you yesterday, because he just sent me the book, he says, this book should be translated into English because in Spain it has been overlooked. The reviews were good. I've never had bad reviews of this or any other book. In general, they are very good. But the common people don't, I mean, the usual readers just don't get it. In my last published book, which is Walt Whitman Does Not Live Here Anymore, which is a collection of essays on North American literature, which is my real self. What I know most is about North American writers. I teach Spanish literature, I teach Latin American literature. I know about that, but what I know really about is North American literature for the reasons we said before. So going back to what happens with Aurora Lee is that this is a book maybe for international audience. What Enrique Vilamata says is that it's important to have the book translated into English. And I think it may happen, and there I will be honest and serious. But the response to my contradiction is dual, okay? On the one hand, I'm going to say, yes, don't be silly and publish Aurora Lee in English. And the other book remains in the drawer, not ready for publication yet. So that is the response to, in part.
I think there's something fascinating about all of this, and your feeling that you're maybe in the clip that was played earlier, you seemed surprised to hear that you were using a technique some people had associated with Cervantes. I guess I'm wondering, given how much interaction you've had with North American literature, whether or not you see like American writers as being more influential on your work than Spanish or international writers. Do you feel that way about your work?
What I think is that very early on, I began, when I was very familiar with English language literature, English writers and then North American writers, from very early, from since I was a teenager. And that's what I read mostly and what I connected with. And I didn't connect so much with Spanish language literature, although I read everything as well. And I did a PhD in Spanish literature in New York. That's the reason why I stayed so long, because I have this possibility, which allowed me the opportunity of revising the whole entire Spanish language canon in Spain and in Latin America, from Middle Ages to now. But what I always did, and before I came to this country, is I have translated some 20 books from English into Spanish, some of them very important, like The Saltweed Factor by John Barth, a collection of 92 poems by Sylvia Plath, the great American poet, novels by William Dean Howells, Charles Brockden Brown, the first American novelist, the Gothic writer, who then stopped writing. So my work as a translator was very important. And when I came here and I continued to teach, a new aspect of my personality began to develop. I began to interview North American writers, like John Barth, for instance, and all the writers that I mentioned before. I was here, that were mentioned before by Miguel. I was here, and they would call me from Diario 16 and say, "Oh, Eduardo, can you try and interview Norma Mailer or Don DeLillo?" I said, "Yeah, sure, of course." So I had the opportunity of talking to all these people. So one of the awards is one for awards given to Call Me Brooklyn was the Premio Ciudad de Barcelona, the City of Barcelona Award. And the citation indicates specifically, I was given the award from importing the techniques of North American literature into the Spanish-speaking world, maybe Spain. That's what the citation says. I believe that this is a very complex process and it is completely unconscious. The mention to Cervantes is very interesting in that I was totally unaware of that. It was a very prestigious critic who said to me, well, this is what Cervantes was doing. Of course, Cervantes was doing everything before anyone. I mean, he invented metafiction, right? When in chapter 8, he says, sorry, readers, I have to interrupt here because there's no more of the story. I'll come back. And he comes back in chapter 9 with a different narrative.
Yeah.
So I wasn't, it's a technique that has to do with the fact that I don't believe that anyone owns the narration. But I don't know, that's elaborating on something that ultimately is unconscious.
Well, this idea of a text belonging to no one and all this sort of intertextuality in your books, it's interesting because I probably associate some of those things more with international literature than with North American literature. So I think some of the North American writers you were influenced by were themselves maybe influenced by international literature. So there's this really complicated interchange going on in some of what you're saying, I think.
There's an essay by John Barth, which is quite old now, which is the literature replenished, I think it is. The exhaustion of literature, where he says the novel is finished. This is a form that no longer works. And then he said, well, yeah, it may work. And you know, thanks to whom? He said, well, thanks to two guys named Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Jorge Luis Borges. So I believe that North American literature is very parochial in many ways, is very important, is highly influential. Melville, you know, you name them, right? Scott Fitzgerald, everybody, Pynchon these days, Don DeLillo, so many others, Hemingway, all of those. And it is read all over the world, but it's a little bit endogamic. They are not paying attention to what happens outside. You are an exception because you are highly influenced by European writers. So I think that the European literature has not, with the exception of perhaps France, because Americans have this absurd or somewhat absurd fascination with France, which they have great writers, of course, who could deny that. So I think that there's little awareness of European literature here. But things are changing very rapidly, I think. More things are being translated right now. Certainly, there is a complete blindness to Spanish literature, to literature from Spain. And this is the right place to say it. I mean, in a conversation made possible thanks to the cultural office of the Spanish embassy. The year I arrived here, there was a very important meeting that I attended when nobody knew my name, so I could say what I wanted. It took place in the Spanish Institute, and the biggest Spanish language names were there, like Javier Marías, Soledad Puerto, many very important writers. So the thing is that they asked the writers, why do they translate so many Latin American writers and no Spanish writers? And I think that just because they don't know them, and also because in general, this is what I could say then, and I say it very shyly because there are great writers from Enrique to many others. It's just that I don't think that the quality of the Spanish literature can compare with the rest of the 20-some nations where they have great writers. So we are one more nation there, but we are producing also very interesting writers, I think, now.
Yeah, I've always sort of felt that one reason I've been drawn to non-American literature is that it sometimes takes more chances, can have a degree of higher complexity. And you've been talking, a lot about these ideas in your own work of like a story belonging to no one, for instance. And I thought that it might be good to hear you reading from the more recent book, I Always Knew I'd See You Again, Aurora Lee, because you talk a little bit about this in this translated clip. So maybe let's hear that and talk about it a little bit. So Ander, if you're listening, that would be clip 3, the beginning to Aurora Lee.
Esta historia empieza y termina con un libro, aunque al final el libro es lo de menos. Mi nombre, como se decía cuando aún había novelas, no importa demasiado. Surgirá cuando lo exija la estrategia de este informe. Una tarde de invierno, a finales de 2009, descubrí en la mesa de novedades de la librería St. Mark's en el East Village neoyorquino un ejemplar de un libro de Vladimir Nabokov cuya existencia me era enteramente desconocida, el original de Laura. Lo cogí con mucha curiosidad y leí en la contraportada que se trataba de una novela que el escritor ruso había dejado inacabada al morir. Intrigado, me puse a hojear el volumen. Se trataba de un conjunto de fichas manuscritas plagadas de borrones y tachaduras. No sé bien qué me hizo decidirme a comprar el libro, pero lo cierto es que lo leí de un tirón aquella misma noche y cuando terminé se había adueñado de mí una sensación sumamente extraña, una inquietud que no acababa de entender. El texto de la novela, repartido de manera irregular entre sus fichas, me planteaba un reto al que me sentía obligado a responder, solo que no sabía cómo. Pese a su carácter imperfecto y fragmentario y a la ingente cantidad de errores de que estaba plagado aquel conato de novela, lo que había leído me resultaba fascinante. No me lo podía quitar de la cabeza. Se apoderó de mí la idea no de terminar lo que Nabokov había dejado poco después de haberlo comenzado. Eso hubiera sido un despropósito, además de un empeño imposible. ¿Qué diablos me proponía hacer?, me pregunté a mí mismo. Tras pensarlo bien, creo que logré entenderlo. ¿Qué forma hubiera podido tener el texto de El original de Laura si la muerte de su autor no le hubiera impedido terminarlo? La idea tenía algo de enloquecedor. Cuando terminé la lectura eran las 3 de la madrugada. No podía llamar a nadie para contárselo. Me tomé un somnífero y me acosté pensando que lo primero que haría en cuanto me despertara sería llamar a Arnold Swift para hablarle del hallazgo y de mi descabellada decisión. A las 11 de la mañana me presenté en el garito donde le gusta recluirse a escribir, el café Dada en Brooklyn. No acabo de entenderte, David. ¿Qué es lo que te propones hacer exactamente? Hay una novela encerrada en estas fichas, tal vez 2. Alguien tiene que sacar a la luz todo esto. Es un texto abortado, dijo Arnold. Tal vez no debiera haberse publicado. Por lo que respecta al libro en sí, es un objeto muy hermoso, una edición lujosa desde el punto de vista material, pero no se puede hablar de obra literaria. Las críticas no fueron, lo que se dice, muy elogiosas, y con motivo. No supe qué contestar. Tenía toda la razón. Los nabokovianos más recalcitrantes, gente como Martin Amis, tan cercano a Nabokov en sus años finales, y uno de sus mejores exégetas, no vieron ningún valor en el texto. Al igual que le ocurrió a su biógrafo, Brian Boyd, Amis se las vio y las deseó tratando de justificar la decisión de su hijo Dmitri, que había tardado más de 30 años en decidirse a publicarlo. Antes de morir, Nabokov había dejado instrucciones inequívocas pidiendo que la obra fuera destruida. En lugar de ello, Vera, su mujer, decidió guardarla en la caja fuerte de un banco suizo.
Hearing that clip, first of all, it brought me back to some things that were said about 20 minutes ago. Just this idea of the sort of literary esoterica collected in this unfinished work reminded me a little bit of when you were talking about your own notebooks, your Brooklyn notebook, and how it just contained all these bits and pieces, and how this idea of I did not know how to complete the story. It feels like that was sort of a direct reference in a way to your work on Call Me Brooklyn and other works, where it feels like a work has to gestate for some time in order for it to be ready to be written. But this idea of a story belonging to no one, I wonder if you could talk about this idea and this idea of like bringing it out, as your protagonist says here, like bringing the work out. Do you feel a responsibility yourself to bringing these stories out, even if you don't intend to publish them?
I will have to, now you gave me a problem because I have to think about it carefully. It seems to be something important there that has called your attention, and I will respond now. I wanted to finish about Aurora Lee and the reception of my work and the idea of working posthumously, which when I presented in the city of La Coruña in the north of Spain, Aurora Lee, the room was packed with friends, not friends, with family. They all bought the book and got it signed. And as I was signing the books, I was looking at them in the eyes and saying, when will they stop? Page 3? Page 5? How long? And then they don't know what to say. That's the difficulty. The idea of the story not belonging to anyone, again, is something very unconscious because I see there is a thread in the 3 books. The first book, which I published at 51, so my joke was that if that was the case, my next book will come out when I'm 100. So that might happen. But apart from that, is that Aurora Lee is also a response to the same question. It's a text that doesn't belong to anyone, does not belong to Nabokov. And I'm going to keep an eye on the clock because it's a very long answer, so I make it as short as I can. So this is an idea that what I did, I mean, as I was reading the beginning of the novel, I realized the other day when Anders sent us the clip that it's not a novel, it's what actually happened. That happened as is told there, so it's not fiction. I just went crazy when I saw those index cards because I realized what a bright mind was trying to do and never did. The story is very interesting because one day I ran into Martin Amis on the street and then at a book fair, and I told him my idea, and he said, listen. All right, I understand. There's nothing there, okay? That should be very clear. That is a bad, something that should not have been published. I don't know, it's interesting, but that's not a book. When I met him the next time in Mexico, he was reading a book called Stalking Nabokov, which came out later on. It was March, he was reading the advanced copy, and I said, and he said, well, you know, this is a very interesting book, you should read it later. So I waited till October when it came out, and I read it, and what happened with the original of Laura is that Vera Nabokov, Brian Boyd, who had written every scrap of paper written by Nabokov, said to her, can I have a look at that manuscript? I have not read ever by him. And she said, no, you cannot, but you can come to Switzerland, read the index cards aloud to you, you cannot take notes. So Brian Boyd traveled from Australia to Switzerland, sat at a distance from Vera Nabokov, listened carefully, came out and announced to the world, this was in fact shit. There's no worth in it. Of course he didn't use the word. But that's the message that he sent to the world. It was not worth it. This is what Martin Amis said. Now come back to October. I read the book, and the last chapter of Stalking Nabokov is titled The Original of Laura, a Recantation. And it says something along the lines, these lines, I was wrong. This is a most interesting book. He has something in his head. Well, I anticipated that when I read it, and I gave a response in the form of a novel. So, like Kafka when he died, the book didn't belong to him. And it's better that it is unfinished, which is a notion that I love, like Pale King. The unfinished book is something that attracts me very much. Because if Nabokov, who was 76 or something, had finished this novel, it would have certainly been a mediocre novel. One of the bad ones, well, Nabokov, you know, writers have bad books, no exceptions. The fact that he didn't finish it leaves the material alive there for anyone to play with. So this is what I had my fictional characters do, play with that live material. That's why I created this character. One of them is called David Mitchell, which in Spain, some critics say, oh, Eduardo Lago thinks he's very smart. This David is the author of Cloud Atlas. We know who he is. Lago, you're not the only one. I'm not hiding anything. I'm playing with facts. But he is a ghost writer in the book. What happens is that a real writer goes to a literary agency, which I did, not the by the agency, and then I asked, can a ghostwriter finish this book by Nabokov? Of course, anything you want, if you pay, we'll do it. So I decided to have my characters do it themselves. So the idea of not belonging to anyone is a question whose answer merits more thought, because it's very profound. And I think that it is present in everything that I do, because the last book, the one that what I call my posthumous novel, to my friends despair, they said, don't say that. So in my posthumous novel, I realized that I came back for the third time to the same idea, which is that a novel begins somewhere, goes nowhere, and someone brings it to fruition, but without closing all the dots, leaving many open spaces, which is my idea of living literature. So there's that continuity.
Well, it's very interesting because the idea that David Mitchell is the name of a character in the book. Are you aware that Mitchell in Cloud Atlas was drawing on the structure of Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler? Have you heard that?
Yeah, from you.
Yeah, he was always interested in the idea that those books that you get only the first several pages of in If on a Winter's Night, Mitchell always wondered, like, what would it be like if those books were completed? And of course, he didn't try to do what you literally have done, which is complete an uncompleted text. But structurally, he liked that idea of having like half of a text that then would get finished later on. So these ideas of intertextuality, I think, again, are things I see in your work and in some of the North American writers you like the most.
Yeah, I think it's very true. And I mean, Calvino is a very important writer to me. When I teach European literature, I always include Calvino. And this is a very important novel. Also, his thoughts about the novel. I think that it is where the contemporary novel is right now. And that is the good part about American literature. But also now there are many young Latin American and Spanish writers doing these things. Like there's Alejandro Zambra from Chile, Enrique Villamagna. So this is a new idea of literature. Anyway, like you, I imagine, I write. I have to write to find out what I want to write. So only when I'm writing do I know where I'm going, if I ever know.
Yes, it very much is like that for me too. And it probably would not be very enjoyable without that feeling of discovery as you go. Should we, Eduardo, let's, I know that we have another clip of you reading from Aurora Leigh, which sort of brings us back to New York and might be a good way for us to sort of finish our time here together. Would you like to hear that? Maybe we could hear that.
Okay.
Andrew, would you play that fourth clip?
Tras mi conversación con Arnold Swift, me fui en metro a Manhattan. Era mi último día en el New Yorker. Apenas quedaba nada en mi despacho. Dejaba la revista con sentimientos encontrados. Nadie me había pedido que me fuera, pero tampoco me presionó nadie para que me quedara. Fui yo quien tomó la decisión. No sé hasta qué punto me mentía a mí mismo, pero la excusa que puse fue que quería tener más tiempo para mí. Seguiría enviando colaboraciones, pero sin necesidad de ir a mi despacho cada día. Fue un golpe duro. Me costó abandonar un trabajo que llevaba desempeñando desde hacía muchos años. Metí las cosas que aún tenía allí en una mochila pequeña y me eché a la calle. Salí del edificio sin decir adiós a nadie, como si fuera a volver al día siguiente. Cuando me quise dar cuenta, estaba en Columbus Circle. Pensé en adentrarme en Central Park, pero algo, no sé muy bien qué, me hizo pensar en mi amiga, Nicole Pierogi. Nicole es una mujer un tanto especial y decidí hacerle una visita. A mucha gente le sorprende que me lleve tan bien con ella. Es agente literaria, una de las mejores que hay en Nueva York. Es de origen bielorruso y tiene fama de carecer de escrúpulos. Es cierto que como profesional es despiadada y agresiva, tal vez porque en un ámbito como el suyo no sea aconsejable actuar de otra manera. A mí me gusta mucho como es, no en el ámbito profesional, en eso no me meto, sino como ser humano. Siempre me ha caído muy bien. Es una mujer inteligente, con un gran sentido del humor, sumamente atractiva y reservada. Circulan numerosos rumores acerca de su pasado y hay una aureola de misterio en todo cuanto guarda relación con sus affairs, pero nada de eso me afecta en absoluto, como tampoco me afecta la misteriosa costumbre que tiene de desaparecer del mapa por largos periodos de tiempo, semanas enteras, seguidas, a veces. Nadie sabe qué hace entonces ni a dónde va. Me gusta la idea que tiene de Nueva York. Cuando me explica lo que significa para ella, dice que es un punto de llegada, el único que ha logrado encontrar tras numerosos años durante los que estuvo huyendo, sin saber muy bien de qué. Hay mucha gente aquí que se siente igual que yo, me dijo un día. Individuos que tras años de arrastrar el peso de su existencia sin saber qué hacer, llegan aquí e inmediatamente comprenden que no les queda ningún otro lugar a donde ir. Nueva York es el final del camino para mucha gente de vida rota.
It is such a treat for me to be able to listen to you read and to see these English translations because I've been able to experience so little of your work beyond Call Me Brooklyn, which is written in Spanish and which I do not know well enough to experience. Do you think that New York is the end of the road for people with broken lives, Eduardo?
Well, I don't like to interfere with my character's opinions. It's up to them. Yeah, I think so. What I would like to say is that this excerpt from the novel connects with what you were saying before about why publish or not publish. This takes place in New York City, which is the literary center of North American literature, and it goes to many literary agencies. When the book is published, I may be in trouble because the names barely disguise the names of real agents, but it's done with a lot of humor. Like Peter Bailey is there. Who is Peter Bailey? Rings a bell. Oh, Andrew Wiley, maybe. Okay, so it's an exploration of what surrounds literary creation through agencies, through all the things that you and I and our writers must go through these days, the publishing world, and also the city of New York. I mean, Call Me Brooklyn was described by a critic as a love letter to New York, which it is, and it's my response. And New York made me aware of the fact that I could be a published writer without betraying my principles. So it's many things there, but there in the novel we find characters like, besides David Mitchell, we have Foster Wallace, we have Franzen, reproducing aspects of real life. So yeah, I see you smile and chuckle. So it's a very comic novel. I mean, it has a lot of humor. It's a satire of this world, but there's also a sad component. I don't know if I answered your question, but for me, sometimes they tell me I call El País, and after many years of writing them, say, New York is no longer the center of the world. No, it's no. And this is years ago. And they come up with no substitute. They said to me, LA. What? LA? Los Angeles, what are you talking about? Same thing, Berlin. Berlin, I love Berlin. I've spent there 2 summers. Listen, guys, maybe next millennium. But for now, nothing beats New York, as we have seen in this horrible situation. I've lived moments during the pandemic here, from the outbreak, from the looting, the Black Lives Matter. There's nothing as alive as this in the entire world. Not that these things didn't happen in other places, but not like here. And something that I will never forget is the day that Trump was not re-elected. I mean, that was a huge, monstrous festival. Like Paul Auster said, New York is not the United States exactly. It's more like one of those city-states, like in the Greek world, and it has nothing to do with Trump territory.
Yeah, so
yeah.
a world within the world. Yeah, it is. It's true. Having lived here for most of my life, I feel the same way. I was smiling partly because I was thinking about how in Call Me Brooklyn, you essentially have a Thomas Pynchon character, although I don't believe you name him, but.
Well, just with the initials in Greek, also Mark Rothko, the painter, all many different aspects of North American literature. It's a very complex novel because, but we cannot talk about that. We said enough already.
Well, there are a couple of questions here that people have posted for you, and I wonder if I could read one of them to you. What American young writer do you recommend to Spanish readers? And what Spanish young writer do you recommend to American readers?
The response to those questions are in my last book, meaning that I wrote Walt Whitman does not live here anymore because I get this question all the time. So more than particular names, and I don't know about the latest ones. I'm not familiar with them. I think that the last biggest name was Foster Wallace. Now I have to go back to him. And then the most difficult part is going back to whom to recommend from Spain. And I cannot move beyond Vilamatas. And then there are some Latin American writers that I really like. This is a very complicated question, and it has to be addressed in a seminar so that we can read the works and respond adequately. And there's a very important component of my own ignorance, because living here for so long, I sometimes miss very important writers. It would be totally inadequate, besides stupid, to say that there are no good writers in Spain. I'm sure there are. I don't know them well enough among the young ones. I know some in Latin America, but this has to do with the fact that I'm more connected to Latin America, New York, because it's also a very Latin American city.
Yes, that's a fair answer, and we'll all look forward to that seminar.
So I cannot go back. Yes, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I have one other question here that was in the chat, which is more utilitarian, which is, do you create any type of storyboard to organize your thoughts? I think I know the answer to that, but go ahead.
I must, otherwise I'm lost enough already, so I have to do that. For me, the most important or the most difficult aspect of writing a novel is structure. It's time and structure, but the structure of Call Me Brooklyn or any other novel is the most complicated thing. So I need to have a map for our object, which was a storyboard in like 16 different colors, trying to follow what Nabokov was doing and then what I did myself. So yes, it's an absolute need. Otherwise, I don't know where I am. It's like the narration is less important than the structure.
Yes. Thinking again about those original notebooks you talked about, the Brooklyn Notebook, and how it probably took some time to organize all of that chaos into something.
Yeah, one chapter I had to write 72 times. No, it was, and then chapter 1 became chapter 2, I mean chapter 7 and things like that. Before we end, I would like to say that David Hollander is a very interesting writer in his own right. And he has just published a book called Anthropica, which is getting very good reviews, the last one in the Los Angeles Review of Books. So I want to credit him and thank him for being here, but he's a very interesting writer that deserves to be read.
Thank you, Eduardo. And you know, you were one of the readers of that book when it was a manuscript, and I've always just had the highest possible opinion for you and your work. And this was really a treat for me to be able to talk to you in this context. And I guess it's 11:55. I suppose we should probably ask Miguel to step in and close the event for us, don't you think?
Yes.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Eduardo. Looking forward for joining that seminar if it ever happens. I just like to finish by saying thanks to the Hispanic Division of the Library of Congress for this project, for this Palabra Archive. I think it's great to have the voices of the authors reading their works. And thank you also to the IberoAmerican Cultural Attaches Association for this series of conversations that we're gathering and that we're having. And it's a great pleasure to work with them. And thank you both. Thank you, Ander Lopez in our cultural office, who has worked a lot in this project. And just to tell the audience to read David, read Eduardo, and go to read. That's what we should all do. And happy to see you here. Happy to see you with us in Spain Arts and Culture. And our next literary event is the 10th of December. We have Manuel Vilas, who is introducing his new book, Ordesa, published here in the States.
Okay.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, Miguel. Miguel is also a writer, it must be said, and Manuel Vilas is a very interesting writer. Yeah.
This is really great, Eduardo. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, David. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Ander.
Yes, and I'll see you on the other side, my friend.
Okay.